During the 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union were involved in a tense disagreement known as the Cold War. The United States were capitalists, yay! And the Soviet Union were communists, boo! Tensions between the US and Soviets increased as both continued to develop atomic weapons. But this was not enough, and the US and Soviets turned their attention to an even bigger project, the race for space. This is the moon landing, in plain English. The space race began on October 4th, 1957, when the Soviet Union launched the satellite Sputnik. This upset Americans because the Soviets had a reputation for having a backwards economy and because they were communists. The US was also supposed to be the leader in science and technological advances, yet the Soviets got to space first. This also heightened the US fear of a nuclear attack by the Soviets because they were not sure what the satellite Sputnik was capable of. This put more pressure on the United States to develop and launch their own satellite.
On January 31st, 1958, the U.S. launched its first satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit. The U.S. was able to redeem itself not only by equaling the accomplishments of the Soviets, but by surpassing them because Explorer 1 reached a higher orbit than Sputnik.
Beep beep!
But the U.S. and the Soviet Union did not stop at this. They wanted to prove their power through more achievements in space. The U.S. increased defense spending and funding for space programs after Sputnik was launched. Congress passed the National Defense Act of 1958, which supplied federal grants for science, math, and foreign language programs in schools. The government also provided extensive financial support toward research for better designs of rocket boosters and surveillance satellites.
The armed forces had originally been in charge of overseeing the funds put into space programs. But when the funds increased, President Eisenhower saw the need to create an administration to take over funding. NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was created to assure efficient use of money, production of space vehicles, and conducting and overseeing space research. NASA also focused on rocket building to ensure the newest technology in space exploration. Their first task was to land a man in space. On September 12, 1962, John F. Kennedy delivered a speech at Rice University in an effort to garner support for U.S. space programs. The exploration of space will go ahead, whether we join in it or not, and this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon and to the planets beyond, and we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but a banner of freedom and peace. We have vowed that we shall not see space filled with weapons of mass destruction, but with instruments of knowledge and understanding. Yet the vows of this nation can only be fulfilled if we in this nation are first, and therefore we intend to be first. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one that we are willing to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and the others too. John F. Kennedy's ultimate goal was to win the space race with the Soviet Union and land on the moon. The U.S. eventually created many programs to achieve John F. Kennedy's dream of getting into space. The first was the Mercury program, whose goal was to send a single man into orbit. This dream, however, was first realized by the Soviets, who sent Yuri Gagarin into orbit on April 12, 1961. The U.S. soon followed this, however, by sending Alan Shepard into space. The Gemini program was the second program, with the goal of sending 2 men into orbit. The Soviets outshined the U.S. during the Gemini program, when Alexei Leonov was the first man to ever do a tethered spacewalk. The U.S. eventually accomplished the same task, however, when Edward White performed a tethered spacewalk on Gemini 4. After this was completed, the U.S. turned its attention to the Apollo program, whose goal was to send 3 or more men into orbit. Once again, the Soviets outshined the U.S. by launching Voskhod-1, the first three-man spacecraft. Even though the Soviet Union was the first to launch a three-man spacecraft, the U.S. did not give up and continued with the Apollo program. The first spacecraft created under the Apollo program was Apollo 1. However, shortly after launch, Apollo 1 became engulfed in flames. And this spacecraft was eventually a failure.
Aww.
The next two spacecraft were Apollo 2 and 3. These spacecraft were disassembled to determine why Apollo 1 caught fire. The next three spacecraft were Apollo 4, 5, and 6. These spacecraft were unmanned and were successfully launched. The next two were Apollo 7 and 8. These spacecraft were manned and were successfully launched. Apollo 7 orbited the Earth, and Apollo 8 orbited the Moon. The next spacecraft created was Apollo 9. This spacecraft was created to practice separating and docking. Apollo 10 was the next spacecraft, and it eventually approached the Moon. The United States' greatest success was Apollo 11. Its landing was unprecedented because it was the first manned spacecraft to land on the Moon. Apollo 11 touched the lunar surface on July 20th, 1969, and Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first two humans to ever walk on the Moon. The Soviets were never able to make a successful manned moon landing.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Neil Armstrong, July 20th, 1969.
The biggest social effect was the increase in American morale. The live television broadcast allowed many supportive Americans to witness the groundbreaking event as the American flag was placed on the moon's surface. A day of national participation was created to honor the moon landing on July 21st, 1969.
Yay.
All government offices, schools, and small businesses were encouraged to close in order to take part in this uplifting event. The moon landing also produced multiple economic effects. The Apollo program set a precedent for future operations in space. As John F. Kennedy once said, "No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space." After Apollo 11, there would be 5 more lunar missions to further the knowledge of space and technology. The United States' increased need for knowledge of space led to the direct increase of improving math and science education in schools and increased government spending for future space endeavors. However, funding could no longer meet the needs of a full-out space race, and the heightened competition would have to come to an end. The United States and the Soviet Union eventually cooperated in a joint space project known as the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project, which was the first manned space mission joined by 2 nations. This was a turning point in U.S. and Soviet relations because it marked the end of competition in space exploration and the beginning of international cooperation. Just a recap. The launch of the Soviet satellite, Sputnik, increased U.S. and Soviet tensions, which pressured the U.S. to develop better space technology, which eventually resulted in the spacecraft Apollo 11 landing on the Moon. This moon landing increased U.S. morale, U.S. funding of science, math, and technology programs, and dissolved the original Soviet-U.S. tensions. For more information, visit...
We went to the moon in 1969, not 1970, but a year sooner. We went to the moon in 1969, that's when they made a landing that was lunar.
And remember, not.
We went to the moon in 1969, not 1968, but the year after.